In this video, you're going to be learning how to analyze whole class data, and we're also going to be looking at specific things such as visualizing data, being able to attain the average of the data, and different ways to look at whole class data, specifically focusing on subgroups, and then from there be able to engage in evidence-based decision making, which is a critical skill for teachers to implement and to have and inform their day-to-day decision making. So the first step we're going to be doing is we will be using Google Sheets to conduct our data analysis in. So we're simply going to go search Google Sheets, and you can access Google Sheets in this manner. So you're going to see this here. We're going to click on a blank, so we're just going to click here. And you can go ahead and title this as data analysis. Okay, so if you had the opportunity to collect data at this point, you're going to go ahead and enter your data on here, specifically your whole class data. So if you did not have the opportunity to gather data, then that is not a problem. You should have simulated data that you can go ahead and analyze. So let's say that our case is the latter. We did not have an opportunity to collect data. So let's say we're just going to go ahead and analyze this simulated data. So there's going to be multiple options for you to input your data. You can go ahead and manually input the data, or if you already have it in a Word document, then you can simply go ahead and copy and paste your data over here. So we're doing exactly that. Now at this point, you should have identified specific students with regards to students who have specific needs. So for instance, here we know student 3 is an emerging bilingual student, or English language learner, ELL student. Student number 9 is considered SPED with ADHD. And we see these particular examples of students. So at this point, you should have an idea of who your students are, right? Because as teachers, it's really important for us to know all of our students because we want all of our students to be successful. So we know that some students are going to need a little bit more support than other students, and other students would benefit from differentiated instruction to meet their needs. So the first step we will do will be to determine what the class average for this particular data set is. So we're just going to go ahead and write average. And we're going to use the formula equals average. And we're just going to select our grades here. And we see that we had a class average of a 76.9. We can round that to a class average of 77. So in your narrative, when you're writing your narrative, that could be something that you could potentially talk about in the sense of, well, you know, as a class, the whole class had an average of a 77. Now we can also find out what our lowest grade is, and we're going to name this our minimum. And we're just going to say equals minimum. And we're going to select our numeric data set. And we find that the lowest grade was a 50, so that could be also something you discuss in your narrative of the whole class. We can also find our maximum. And same concept. Now here, instead of saying minimum, we're going to say maximum. And we're going to select our data set. And we found that our highest grade was a 95. And we can also find our mode, which is essentially the grade that was the most commonly occurring value. So the one that was the most common. So let's find that out. And it seems like that was our mode, right? An 80, right? So several students had an 80. That was the most common grade among the whole class. Okay, so great. Now, there's going to be different ways that we can go ahead and visualize this particular data. So one of the ways we organize the data is as a table, which we have here. Now, another particular way that you could potentially visualize the data is by creating a chart. So to create a chart, we can go ahead and highlight our entire data values or data set, including student name and grade. And we're going to hover to Insert, and we will click on Chart. And we see the particular charts. Now, we don't want a histogram. That is not going to be the most appropriate. So let's say we want to look at all of the students, right? So this would probably be a more appropriate chart. Now, you'll notice that you can hover over these and change them. So here we're just going to say whole class summative assessment data. And that would be a more appropriate title. Now you can go ahead and maximize this. You can also center this as well, right? And when we look at this, sometimes you'll notice that in this particular case, what would be our maximum grade? Well, in this case, it's 100. So we want to make sure that when we are presenting our data is as accurate as possible. So if we had, say, a maximum number of 75 or 95, then that would not really present the data in the most accurate way possible, because, say, a student who had an 85 would be pretty close to the maximum, right? So that could be a little bit misleading. But here that's not the case, so it's from 0 to 100, which accurately depicts the situation here for students, right? A student could have attained a higher grade. So when we double click here, we have multiple options here. Now, for this particular one, it is going to be your personal preference in terms of how you would like to present the data. And by that I mean, for example, you have multiple, so for instance, if you would like to change the background color to something like this, you certainly could, right? You can also change the border color if you would wish. You can also change this as a 3D, right? If you would like to visualize it in that manner, you can maximize it, so you can do that. Of course, you can also change the chart and axis titles. You can change the color. You can also indicate, if you would like to have a series present. You certainly can do that as well. If you wanted to create data labels, right, to visualize the grades, you could absolutely do that as well. And then of course you have the option of having a legend here, horizontal axis, vertical axis, as well as grid lines, right? So generally speaking, this is how we go upon creating our data, our chart, to be able to visualize our particular data, right? So, this is how we can go upon completing this particular task. So I'll just go ahead and close this. We can maximize that like this, right? Now, if you would like to, so let's say, this is your chart, you're ready to add this to the narrative. It's just going to be a simple task in terms of selecting this and copying it over. So there's going to be multiple shortcuts depending on whether you're using a Mac or you're using a PC. But generally you can go ahead and click on the shortcut for copy. So you can just, in this case, I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to do Command C for copy. But you can also do edit and then copy, and then go, let's say this was our particular narrative. Then we can just paste this. So I'm going to go ahead and again, Command copy, Command V, paste, and then that is our chart that will illustrate the whole class summative assessment data. Now, looking at this, right, again, on your narrative, you can talk about how perhaps the average is 77, the lowest grade was a 50, the maximum grade was a 95, and the grade that was the most common among students was an 80, right? Of course, okay, so great. We are able to analyze the data as a whole class, right? Now, sometimes, for example, if we were to only focus on the average, we could potentially say, well, our average was a 77, which, seems that although not necessarily a B or an A, it seems like most students have an understanding, right? And then you could proceed and say, well, let's go ahead and go on to the next task, right? Now, if we look, and that this is a great segue to the next item, which is focusing on looking at the subgroups, right? And, going back to equitable education in the sense of making sure that all students are learning, right? In other words, that we are looking at the data, analyzing the data to try to identify potential gaps present and, restructuring the lesson to help address those particular gaps. So in order to do that, we have already at this point looked at the data as a whole class, but that is not the end of our data analysis. It's really important for us to also look closely at our particular subgroups, right? And that is why in the beginning I said you want to make sure that you have an understanding of who your students are. So particularly, how many students are EB/ELLs, how many students are SPED, and you know that with SPED students, they will have an IEP. So as teachers, we need to be well informed of that particular student's IEP, right? And you might also have 504 students and GT students as well. So, ultimately we need to make sure we are well informed of our students' needs. So now that we have conducted a whole class data analysis, we're going to go ahead and proceed to a subgroup data analysis. So we're going to go ahead and do that on a different sheet. So we're going to add a sheet by clicking here. And I'm just going to go ahead and title this subgroup data. And this one will just say whole class data. Okay, so here we have multiple subgroups as we can see. So we have EB/ELLs, SPED, Section 504, and GT students. So we have 4 particular groups. So we're going to copy this 4 times. So we're going to say this is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's just adjust this here. And we're going to go ahead and form our subgroup. So we have the first one, we're just going to go ahead and make it EB/ELLs. So we're going to copy that and paste that over. Student 7 is also an emerging bilingual EB/ELL. Copy this over. And then we also have student 11, who is an EB/ELL student. Okay, great. So now we're going to go ahead and go on to our next group, which would be SPED. So special education. And now we know that per SPED law, right, ADHD is not going to be the only area that falls under SPED, right? It can be many things, right? So as teachers, it's important for us, again, to have an understanding of who our students are and what their particular needs are as well. So then we have student 17 with dyslexia, so we're just going to copy that over and paste it. The next group will be section 504. Let's just adjust this really quickly. and we have 2 students who are section 504. So under section 504, as you know, as we are copying this, these are students that are not SPED. So because they are not SPED, they do not have an IEP, but they do have accommodations, right? So if you ever have a student who is classified as a Section 504 student, they will have a Section 504 plan, and that will provide you particular accommodations and modifications that students might have. So most likely particular accommodations. So now we're going to look at group 4, which would be our GT students. So those would be student 16 and student 18. And we have student 18. Okay, so we have our 4 groups at this point in time. So very similarly to what we did here, we can absolutely determine our average, right? And these, you don't necessarily need a formula to determine these, as the data set is quite small. Just by looking at this, we could potentially determine that. But if you would like to do that, as we did here, you can certainly accomplish that, right? But that would be your preference here. So we're just going to figure out the average. So the average for this data set for the ELL students is a 66.67, so we can round that to a 67. And the average for these students here, we'll just type average and then select here, is a 60. And then our average for these students, for the Section 504 students, is a 77.5, that rounds to a 78. And our average for our GT students is an 87.5, which rounds to an 88. Great. Now that we have figured out the averages for our specific subgroups, then we're just going to go ahead and create a table. So we're going to say subgroups, and we're going to say average. Great. And we have our EB ELL subgroup. We have our SPED subgroup. We have our Section 504 subgroup. And we have our GT subgroup. Now here we can go ahead and input the average grade. So that would rounded to a 67. This was a 60. For 504, this rounded to a 78. And GT students rounded to an average of an 88. At this point in time, we can go ahead and visualize our data, and that would be simply done by selecting the data, of course, and then go to Insert, Chart. And this is what we have here. So, of course, you can check your different axis titles. So here we have our horizontal axis title and our vertical title, axis title. So these seem appropriate. Another thing that you want to check for, again, is going to be the accurate representation of data. So for example, if your maximum was, for instance, a 75 or an 80, then the vertical axis would not be very appropriate. So by that I mean, for instance, if we had a minimum value of 0 and our maximum value was, say, a 90, you see how these are significantly larger, right, which could potentially mislead the person analyzing the data, right? So I'm going to go ahead and undo that, but I just wanted you to be able to see what I was talking about. Now here, we can change the title, right, for a more accurate title. So we can say, for example, subgroup average data. And then, of course, you can center this, right? Again, of course, how you name the title, that will be up to you, right? Now, just keep in mind that, it should be an accurate representation of what it is that you are illustrating here. Now, again, you can customize this as much as you would like, right? You can change the colors if you would wish to do that. Like the chart style, the colors, right? So that is completely up to you, right? But generally speaking, this is how you would illustrate this, and in your narrative, you can definitely discuss that, right? Again, if you wanted to provide the labeling for each particular one, you certainly could if that is what you wanted to do. So for example, you would just click on data labels, and that would provide the data here. So that's how we go upon this. Now, of course, you can absolutely as well create a chart for each particular one. So for example, just really quickly walking you through that, you would select your subgroup, and then you would click on Insert Chart. And again, we have our ELLs, right? Of course, you can change the name, right? So EB, ELL, summative assessment data. And then you can center that. And then if you wanted to label these, then of course you could do that. Right, so that would be up to you. And then you would repeat the same process with each particular subgroup, right? Insert, chart. Of course, making sure that you change the titles, right? So I'm just going to delete this just for space purposes, but you certainly could do that. And then you would do the same thing if you wanted to do that to visualize each particular one. So insert chart, change the title, right? Select these, insert chart, change the title, right? And that's how you could go upon visualizing, of course, both the entire subgroup, or this might be more appropriate, subgroup summative assessment data, both them as a whole, and then each individual one. And that's how you can go upon that and do that. Now, another one of your tasks will be to specify, specific students that did not pass. So, for example, if we were to look at this entire data set, you can go by and start highlighting which particular students did not pass. So here we see student 5, and we don't have any particular condition, like for example, needs for the students, right? If you will, right, in terms of EBELL, SPED, ADHD, right? We don't see that. We don't see a particular label on the student, and we can certainly discuss the potential effects of labels, right, on students. Of course, sometimes these labels can have a negative effect, but sometimes they can have a positive effect in the sense of, they're able to receive specific accommodations and modifications to help support their learning, right? But that is an entire conversation. So here we also see this particular student had a 60, this particular student had a 50, right? So you want to try to identify, 3 to 5 students, and then, you're going to be reflecting on the students, right? And in terms of going on to the next step, which would be potentially redesigning a lesson and being able to engage the students in a re-engagement lesson, right? That would very thoughtfully and very intentionally help close potential gaps. So I hope you found this video helpful. And again, right, once you're ready to export these, all you have to do is just copy them and paste them over to your Word document. And that is how simple it is to create charts and to be able to visualize and analyze the data. I hope you found this video helpful.